All right. Thank you very much. And good afternoon from my side of the world, which is Stellenbosch, South Africa. And good morning to all of you who are in a different part of the world. Welcome to this webinar, which is addressing the topic Achieving Climate SDG Synergies, setting the scene on challenges and opportunities for means of implementation. This is the third in 3 series, and so we have a great panel. We have Baisa Naran, who is the senior analyst from the Climate Policy Initiative. Hector, I'm sorry, I am from a different part of the world. Arce Benavides, who's the director of the National REDD+ strategy from Costa Rica, and then Shahaz Musa, somebody who I do know, director of the Climate Development and Knowledge Network. So it's impossible to emphasize the importance of this topic for us today. Implementing the SDGs and finding a coherent set of actual strategies, financial capacity, institutional, is key for our future in the context of a global planetary crisis. So I think with no further ado, if I can then ask Baisa to please proceed with your talk. Each speaker has 10 minutes. I'll be quite strict so that we have enough time to open the conversation to a wider discussion, and then we will have some closing remarks from our UN colleagues. I'm sorry, there is a fourth speaker. Sorry. Surabhi Raja Gopal, Senior Program Manager from Sustain Plus. So if we can proceed, Baisa Naran, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Can you see my screen and can you hear me well?
Yes, both.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor Mark Swilling. And thank you for the organizers for this event. It's a very great pleasure of mine to join this distinguished panel today and be a part of this crucial discussion. So today I'm going to be sharing with you an overview of the global climate finance flows, as well as opportunities on how climate finance can create synergies with the Sustainable Development Goals through concrete examples from CPI's climate finance tracking work. So CPI is an analysis and advisory organization with expertise in finance and policy, and we support governments, businesses, financial institutions to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. So just a quick word on the global landscape of climate finance. At CPI, we've been tracking global climate finance since 2011, and our global landscape provides the most comprehensive assessment of climate finance flows, drawing on a number of data sources, and it is updated biannually since 2012. So what the landscape does is it helps inform policy and investment decisions and identification of opportunities for scaling up climate finance. It also provides baseline against which to measure progress towards levels of investment consistent with climate goals. So the work is regularly cited by the UNFCCC through the biennial assessment, the IPCC, and it's often used by governments and public development banks and non-government organizations to support decision-making and coordination on climate investment strategies. So in terms of where we currently are, our latest edition of Global Landscape of Climate Finance report looks into annual climate finance flows in 2017 and 18. And we've actually crossed the $500 billion US mark for the first time, and annual flows rose to $570 US on average over the 2 years of 2017 and 2018. So that actually represents about 25% increase from 2015 and 2016 levels. And I must note that the vast majority of climate finance flows, as you can see, is dedicated to mitigation activities. So that's almost 93% of total climate finance flows. And only 5% is directed towards adaptation finance. However, there's some good news. There is an increase of adaptation finance, about $11 billion in 2018. So in 2017, it was about 24.7 billion. So there's almost a doubling happening there. And the 2/3 of this was directed to non-OECD countries. And there's also thing to know that there are some data gaps that make it challenging to estimate the true nature of volume of adaptation finance. And our tracking exercise over the years suggests that climate finance is an increasing trend. This is good news, but we are still falling far short of what is needed to achieve global climate goals and also sustainable development goals. And the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting socio-economic crisis make the mission even more challenging. So here, ambitious and innovative policies for sustainable recovery and even greater collaboration among public and private actors will be needed to achieve climate and sustainable development goals. Now, let's talk about opportunities in creating synergies with climate and the sustainable development goals. So our global landscape is centralized to the SDG 13 goal, most notably, and through input to UNFCCC biennial assessment, we also support the SDG 17. However, through our other climate finance tracking work, we've seen even more interlinks with climate to other sustainable development goals. And here I'm providing a select list of projects where we've observed such synergies, as well as, in some cases, challenges as well. So I will discuss 3 projects in details from the select list. So first of all, through our collaboration with Sustainable Energy for All, we conduct annual stock data of finance flows for electricity and clean cooking committed to 20 sub-Saharan African and Asian countries. So this is where almost 80% of people globally without energy access is located. The focus here is SDG 5, which is affordable and clean energy. Our latest study showed that for the first time since 2013, unfortunately, fossil fuels accounted for the largest portion of electricity finance flows to these high-impact countries. And the question here is really defining what is climate-aligned and sustainable development-aligned finance. And the challenge we face in tracking is what is good enough, and there's a divergence of goal elements here. And the latest 2020 report of this series also proposes a framework for project implementers to improve the accuracy and consistency of reporting finance with a gender equality objective. And the Sustainable Development Goals 5 and 7 are inextricably linked, as a lack of energy access is disproportionately borne by women and girls in the form of health, productivity, and unpaid labor. So defining and measuring the magnitude of development finance for energy access that has gender equality objective remains also a significant challenge. So we've recently also completed a study in collaboration with International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, and we've examined the climate finance gaps in small-scale agriculture. So these insights were based on our global landscape data. So the key finding was that less than 2% of global climate finance actually goes to small-scale farmers in developing countries. And despite their vulnerability to worsening extreme weather and their crucial role in feeding billions of people around the world. And our analysis shows that climate finance goes to small-scale farmers. Small-scale agriculture reached nearly $10 billion in 2017 and 18 again, and that represents approximately 1.7% of the total climate finance tracked. So this is one of the studies where we've seen most opportunities in creating synergies with the Sustainable Development Goals, and Things like making our food system more sustainable through climate-friendly agriculture, supporting indigenous people in protecting biodiversity in forests. And climate finance can actually play an instrumental role in increasing prosperity and climate resilience for the world's most vulnerable populations, especially in this time, and the challenge of leaving no one behind is ever more relevant for this target group. So TPI has been supporting developing countries in tracking national climate finance. So national landscape of climate finance can help governments assess the success of their current policies and governance initiatives to meet climate change mitigation and sustainable development goals. It also supports to enhance the budgeting systems to better track, monitor, and report climate finance across several line ministries. And there are some countries, and as you can see from the presentation, we primarily try to target developing countries. And in relation to that, we also developed a guideline to support any country wishing to develop a national climate finance landscape. And we prepared a step-by-step approach on that. So our work here actually equips governments, ministries, and agencies with necessary tools and capacity to regularly report on their climate-related investments, to really keep a detailed check on progress against investment sectors, and ultimately to prioritize climate and development efforts. So I'll just finish my intervention here with an example of an output from our national tracking exercise, and this is an example from India. Okay. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much for that presentation and the clarity of the images, and it's really encouraging to see the growth in those financial flows. I am very familiar with CPI's work. I'm on the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and we collaborated on a stranded asset project. So thank you for that contribution. So if we could just move on to Hector, if you could please proceed.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to let me share the PowerPoint. Is that okay?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you very much, and your sound is good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the organization of this important event, for the invitation. It's an honor to participate with this very important matter, and also with these honorable colleagues from the panel. Well, I represent here the Forest Financing National Fund, who is in charge of the financial mechanism toward small and owner forest owner here in Costa Rica. I would like to begin talking about like a perverse relationship and a proportional relationship between forest and poverty that happen most in the tropical world, no? This is a map of Costa Rica. You can see there the darker areas where we have more forests, and also there are the more poverty in this country. This obviously generates local effect on the provision of environmental service, such as biodiversity, soil, water resources, and so on and so forth, and also global environmental services like generation of GA gases. Let me go back. Sorry. we have learned that there is a close relationship between loss of environment services and poverty. If we lose forests, we lose biodiversity, soil, water necessary for food production. And if in a country like Costa Rica, if we lose scenic beauty, we lose the most important incomes that we have, that is the international tourism, who has become the main income for the country. More recently, we have learned that a commitment to conserve forests and biodiversity under some different schemes can positively affect some of the sustainable development goals. Among them, no poverty, gender equality, climate action, life in ecosystems, and life in terrestrial ecosystems. Costa Rica started with public policy to protect forests more than 30 years ago. In the 90s, we had forest incentives and also development a robust protected area systems. And during this century, we have developed the Payment for Environmental Services program. So using different mechanisms such as that I comment, Costa Rica has, we can improve our forest cover, like you can see in that slide, without detriment, and that is very important, without detriment to the economic growth of the country. Deforestation had been reduced, and areas with new secondary forests are now grown. Talking in international scenario, Costa Rica has been a pioneer in supporting the REDD+ process. We are convinced that with a significant mobilization of financial resources, forests can contribute to mitigate and adapt the effect of the climate change. We have recently signed two agreements, one for $6 million with the FCPF, the World Bank, and another for $54 million with the GCF. We hope that the resources will come to provide more financial resources to maintain and grow the life quality of our people living in the rural areas. We also hope to sign more agreements like that in the future. And also, it is important to say that since 2014, according to our studies validated by international experts, Costa Rican forest is a net sink of greenhouse gases, and we have a lot of expectation of these international resources, especially during this hard situation due to the COVID, and we expect that also the resources can help us and help our people living in the rural areas after this pandemic. Also, we are moving forward to another mechanism or to another issues, like how to involve the indigenous people. The indigenous people in Costa Rica have taken an important participation on the Red Plus negotiation, and also they have benefited in a very important way during the last years. The payment for environmental services mobilized about $60 million from 1997 to 2018. Another issue that we are addresses is the participation of the rural women. We have different mechanisms to support them, like a loan system toward the rural women, and also we are trying to address their participation in the payment for environmental service. For that, we have developed a gender action plan, like credits and PES programs that favor participation, and we also want to continue contributing to the welfare of the indigenous people and young people and women living in our rural areas. Of course, we have a lot of challenge. I would like to point out some of them. One is related to the land tenure. You know that most of the land tenure is under male hands, and that is difficult to give participation to the women who they don't have the right for the land. We have to reward the participation of so far invisible groups in conservation, that like such as women, youth groups, more indigenous communities, and other groups that contribute to conservation but are not forest owners. Another challenge is the participation of the private sector in mobilized resources, financial and technical resources, to the rural areas by stimulating value change. Just to the end, although that is true that programs such as Red Plus and PES cannot solve all poverty in rural areas, the lesson learned in Costa Rica indicate that they can mitigate it. At the same time, those programs contribute to maintaining forest ecosystems and their environmental services. Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Hector, and thank you for really highlighting this key point that reforestation does not contradict economic growth and the challenge of full inclusion, especially of women. So thank you for highlighting those issues. So over to Shanaz, who, like me, is a South African, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark, and greetings to all of you, and also to thank you for the time that you're taking out to actually listen to all these presentations. So I'm going to be, I'm a director of the Climate Development Knowledge Network, and it's a program that we run from an NGO based in Cape Town, South Africa. And the challenges and the opportunities that I'm going to be speaking to are based on learnings from delivering the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. And I think it's important just to give you some background as to what we do before we dive into the challenges and opportunities. So the Climate and Development Knowledge Network is a brokering, or shall we say translating, adapting, communicating, And we broken knowledge, like all different forms of knowledge, so that it is useful and relevant. And we thereby ensure that the impact is maximized and that the evidence and learning is ultimately used to enhance leadership. The way we work is through 3 pillars. It's knowledge, engagement, and peer learning. And capacity building falls across all of these pillars, and we see it as an outcome of the brokering. And sometimes it's actually a form of brokering itself. So for example, when we have peer-to-peer learning and training, the brokering is in itself a form of capacity building. If you're looking at the SDGs, there isn't a clear one on capacity building, but it is an outcome of all of them. So the Climate and Development Knowledge Network and the lessons that I'm going to be talking to you about, you can go to the 3rd slide, please, is based on a global program that's got a presence in Latin America, Asia, and in Africa. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to talk you through the learnings from capacity building now. But before I do that, to just tell you that what we found is that an overall lesson is that how you do the capacity building is just as important as what you're doing. So for us, it was very much about being respectful, expecting and acknowledging the expertise there is, being collaborative, building very strong trust relationships, and acknowledging existing power dynamics. Next slide. When we start looking at opportunities and challenges, one that shows up as both an opportunity and a challenge is the relationships. And it's because relationships, they happen in the non-tangible space. So you can't force it, but you do need to create circumstances where the relationships can seed and take root, where people feel safe, where there's trust. And often we're needing to think out of the box. And this is the challenge when it comes to capacity building. You need to think out of the box so that the way capacity building is seen is not always activities and training activities. So one example that worked well was a project in South Asia where local government training was used as a way for city officials to actually meet each other. They never met each other because they always worked in silos. They then ended up forming relationships and they started collaborating outside of the official capacity in the city. Another learning also from South Asia is that the manner and frequency and time period of these indications is often more important than the information being shared, and that you do need to use local champions to get your message across. Next slide. One of the others, and we see it as a big opportunity, is that there's rich capacity that exists in the Global South. So learning from the Global South is that the Southern experts, and we've picked this up a lot now as a network that's completely driven from the South, is that Southern experts have the knowledge, the expertise, they have the context and the relationships to lead capacity building efforts. Often what they don't have access to, and here's the challenge, is the access to international conferences, donors, networks. And so it often takes them more time to realize impact, but it also, for us, it took us quite a bit of time, and it still does, to build our pool of Southern experts that we draw on. So I'd like to say this one is really it's a great opportunity that needs to be harnessed in terms of capacity building on the SDGs. Next slide, please. A big challenge that we realized when we were delivering a gender role play game for Ethiopian government officials was that not one size fits all. So we had to learn it the hard way, where we started off with a game that was quite very uniform. But what we learned is that we need to be aware of the context. which can change significantly between neighboring countries. And this is a challenge, is that you need to be open to being wrong and then course correcting and adapting. There's also the opportunity to always ask for advice, to be humble, and ensure that you have a diverse team that's always checking your facts thoroughly. So, I mean, this was one we really learned the hard way, and it was quite a big challenge for us. And then what we've also found is that capacity building, next slide, please, is very much a process. It's not a once-off intervention where you can go in, do a now it's webinars or workshops and then leave. So once-off events or training are very unlikely to allow for in-depth knowledge, collaboration, and trust building for relevant and useful support towards implementation of your SDGs. Your capacity building should be deeply embedded within existing processes. An example that we've got from the Climate and Development Knowledge Network and the Future Climate for Africa is the first Africa Wiki Editathon. What we did here was draw on the wiki process, take a segment out where we got climate scientists from Africa to actually start editing and creating wiki pages. And this is now our guide that we've developed is now on the UNFCCC adaptation page. And then one or a final challenge, that I'd like to close with, last slide please, is that all your interventions must be demand-led and they must be co-produced. So you need to understand what are the areas where capacity building is needed, and then you need to co-create the capacity building interventions. And like we said, hopefully it links onto a process that's already existing. What we've also learned, if I can have the last slide, is that during the COVID crisis is that we've used the online space effectively. We've had to be very innovative. And then also there was always this feeling that we're in this together. So collaboration seemed to happen quicker. However, what we did find, and I think this is an important lesson when we're looking at real capacity building, is that in the virtual space, we found that the relationship building activities, they were significantly hampered. There were no virtual corridors to bump into people, no virtual coffees. And what we also found is that existing power dynamics were strengthened. So for example, the role of the chair, there could be issues there if the power dynamic is not spoken about. And then what became very apparent for us in the capacity building space is that the digital divide is real. Often we think of having interventions with local communities, and most of them we'd have to make sure that they had data, access to data to join. So I think often we take for granted that the digital divide is very real. And with that, Mark, I'm closing off and handing over back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much again for not just referring rhetorically to the need for participation, but getting into the nuts and bolts of what it takes to build the capacity that are required for people to actually engage.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that issue in the conversation we are going to have. So if I can now ask Surabi to talk to us, and then we are going to go into an interactive discussion around some questions that I have.
Thank you so much,
Surabi,
Professor Mark.
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you to, I think it was, thank you for organizing this session, and to all the panelists, because I think these aspects of policy, finance, capacity building are really the ecosystem aspects that we often talk about in our work, and sort of putting that together has been really nice to watch. My name is Surabhi, and I'm with Sustain Plus. Sustain Plus is an initiative that is focused on identifying and scaling up decentralized clean energy solutions for livelihoods, healthcare, and education. And we're an initiative of 3 different organizations. And so we're trying to build up this database of what are scalable solutions in different contexts. Within this, I think it's, I wanted to sort of look at the kinds of interventions we've looked at, as well as the kind of ecosystem that is needed to be built on the ground in order to overcome the challenges to really implement these and see them long-term, sustainable, and scalable. The ecosystem itself, broadly, we like to refer to it in terms of the technology innovation, finance, and being able to unlock the right financial mechanisms and tools, skill development and capacity building, which Shehnaz has also spoken about, and of course, policy and guidelines. And, we have this example of one of the interventions that we looked at around solar water pumping solutions. And it's sort of an obvious one to look at dealing with agriculture issues where you're addressing the need for water, but at the same time also reducing diesel costs and emissions in that process. That may not be the priority of the farmer, but it is definitely feeds into the larger climate action conversation. But what was interesting was that it took us conversations with the NGOs on the ground that work on agrarian issues, that work on issues with farmers in drought-prone areas, to understand that solar water pump just can't be put in isolation. In certain areas, it goes best when you look at it alongside borewell recharge, alongside farm ponds, and alongside other water conservation measures, and efficient irrigation techniques such as drip irrigation. So that was sort of one example where you realize that the capacity building is not restricted to how we talk to communities, but also how we talk amongst ourselves for energy, for organizations working on energy to be able to convey the kind of information that organizations working in environment and climate need to be able to push that message forward, that the development and the climate agenda could go together. We also found that there is an existing government program within India to subsidize solar water pumping solutions. And on the other side, you find that there are existing funds to subsidize borewell recharge or to support farmers in building these farm ponds and watershed management techniques through the horticulture department or the Department for Soil and Water Conservation. And so when we think about climate finance, there is, of course, the larger picture of what are the sources of climate finance, but it would also be worth thinking about how do we unlock existing financing mechanisms that could enable us to have stronger climate resilience strategies or climate mitigation options. The other example that we have is around healthcare solutions. So how do you look at enabling the initial goal that we went with was, of course, how do you enable access to reliable electricity in remote and far-flung areas, particularly for healthcare, where you're talking about primary healthcare, labor rooms, basic energy access, as well as energy access for immunization, for deliveries, and designing that entire solution requires that we understand there's an energy efficiency component to it, where appliances need to be made more efficient, simply because that does affect the cost of decentralized solar energy as well. And how do you look at the built environment component such that natural ventilation and cooling techniques can become a part of the system, where your basic modifications, insulation on the roof, opening out of windows, and simple techniques of built environment design can really reduce your costs as well as improve comfort and well-being for staff working in that health center. And this is particularly problematic in areas that are extremely dry, arid, heat-prone, and deal with heat stress situations. So this is a combination of mitigation and adaptation coming together. But what it did require was, building the capacity of masons on the ground to be able to say what is the kind of built environment technique that works in this particular context. What is the kind of building design that would be best suited for an area that may be heat stress prone, or that may be in an extremely cold climatic condition. With sort of looking at solar powering these health centers, we also realize the way capacity building happens with government and the discussions that you have with government. Although all of us would at some level say that the environment and environmental conservation cannot have a cost on it. At the end of the day, communities have limited resources, governments operate with limited budgets, but being able to say that the cost of diesel or the expenditure on diesel to ensure reliability of electricity in these subcenters to power the baby warmer, to power the suction apparatus, to power the spotlight, or to power basic lighting and fans so that the nurses and the medical staff can function. The diesel cost of making sure of that reliability is much higher than what you would spend on powering it using decentralized energy and adding in a longer term maintenance fund. And so that was sort of a combination of how do you unlock finance, because a lot of government agencies have allocations, but it is for a diesel generator or a power backup, but that power backup is not defined. And a combination of that and capacity building so that the government really is able to appreciate why this intervention makes a difference in terms of their economics and costs as well. And we've worked on relief shelters in cyclone-prone and flood-prone areas where you're looking at school buildings and converting those. And again, the working with the disaster management authorities to be able to say, how do you look at longer-term, more sustainable disaster shelters? It may be a school, but that is a multi-purpose school that acts as a disaster relief shelter. But in that case, powering it with decentralized energy ensures that during that disaster, you have a backup of power and you have access to power. Similarly, when you look at cooling and cold storage solutions, we have existing funds within, financial institutions as well as government bodies to look at agriculture infrastructure or rural infrastructure development. And somewhere it is, we need to start being able to unlock those funds to be able to finance solutions that address both climate mitigation adaptation as well as basic development, whether it's in terms of livelihoods, energy access, basic energy access, or healthcare. I think I just want to say that the capacity building has to happen at so many different levels. You're talking amongst organizations working in these different sectors. We're talking about with government agencies to highlight costs or to highlight benefits in economic terms. We're talking about financial institutions so that local financial institutions and banks are able to give out those loans and realize that what they're giving out has both a climate angle as well as a development angle. They may not see it that way. They may not need to see it that way right now, but over time we can make sure that unlocking finance becomes easier for these sort of solutions by identifying and mapping the kind of opportunities that are there that exist for decentralized energy or for decentralized energy in livelihoods and in healthcare, and looking at the most climate resilient and the best climate mitigation strategy and unlocking funds through that. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for taking us into the nitty-gritty of the complexities of learning, in a sense, at the coalface of implementation. So what we're going to do now is really just open up the conversation. I want to just pose one or two questions that may be somewhat provocative, just to get some responses from the panelists, and then we'll open it up to see whether there's anybody in the broader group of participants who want to pose a question. So, in thinking about the presentations, which are all quite different, so the discussion about financial flows is major private and government players. The reforestation is very much a government initiative, creating incentives for farmers to participate. And then the last two presentations were very much NGOs working with the grassroots at the coalface. And the word that seems to link them all together in my mind is learning. So, given the IPCC reports or many other reports that are coming out, we have a very small window to learn very fast. So accelerated learning for implementation really is the key. So, my questions are really around that. So for the Climate Policy Initiative for BASA, I mean, my question would be based on the tracking of the financial flows. What are you picking up in terms of learning curves? Do you get a sense that as the quantum grows, there's an increasing capacity within financial institutions, public and private, for managing the data, doing the calculations, accelerating the deal flow and the number of transactions? So that's one learning curve. For Hector, I was really interested in this question of male ownership of the land and the challenge of engaging in such a way that the gender power relations with respect to land changes. What has been learned in that interface? And then my question to Shanaz would be also in the vein of learning. So obviously your core business is learning, but I'm wondering whether you could maybe share some of your challenges. You emphasized context matters. So that was a really significant and loud call, especially in the African context. We know that context really matters. But what does that mean for your staff or your the people who you're contracting or subcontracting as they move between contexts? How does that? It's all very well to say context matters, but you have to learn if you're shifting between contexts. And then Sarab, your fascinating stories of dealing with artisans, contractors, people at the front line of the interface between construction and technology. What are the biggest challenges or obstacles in getting people to, in a sense, break from what they know, or in academic jargon, it's lock-in? What does lock-in look like at that coalface, and how do you deal with what is quite often a perception of risk? If I don't do it the good old way, things could go wrong, or I could get into trouble, or it won't be accepted by whoever has power to get me into trouble. So the kind of linking theme is learning, and maybe if we can just start start with you, Baisa, and just see, where this conversation takes us.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Thank you. Maybe do you want to?
Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. The echo I can hear.
Oh, sorry. Let me.
Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, really interesting question. I think it's a crucial question that you asked here. It's about learning and capacity, because we actually see that capacity of the local institutions is one of the challenges that prevent from all this finance to catalyze and really crystallize. But over the years, when CPI has been tracking the climate finance since 2011, we have seen increased capacity and also methodologies actually to define the concept and also define the different methodologies around how do you classify climate mitigation, adaptation, and how do you create synergies and all that. So there are interesting developments by the donors, by the public development institutions in particular. So public development institutions are coming up with different strategies, and they're trying to be more ambitious with their goals. And I can say some of the initiatives that they're doing is, making sure that all of their finances is aligned with climate goals. So things like that are really making a dent in this space. But I think from my perspective, there should be more work done to empower and build more capacity for the developing countries. And this is why we've been paying more attention to national tracking and capacity building. And our latest report on the step guideline is really trying to empower national governments in doing this stock take of what is the current situation with our country's budget and where it is heading in terms of climate investment, because that kind of information is really going to show you a full picture of what's your current state and how you can prioritize different policies and processes. So in that sense, I think it's critical that donors and development finance actually direct sufficient financial resources and human expertise to ensure project managers and other project personnel to have the right capacity to, both in terms of delivering the project, but also accurately report the project so that you can gather more information about what's the current state on finance. And the other thing I think Surabi rightly pointed was that public funding is actually limited. So here the other opportunities is really trying to mainstream climate and sustainable development goals for the private sector. And then from the developed countries, there are some interesting policies happening in terms of assessing climate risk in operations and strategy. And as I pointed out previously, so one of the main contributing factors is this lack of understanding and actually awareness of mainstreaming and institutionalizing climate finance and sustainable development goals. So this is why I think there's more need in capacity building efforts to support banks and actually institutional investors to incorporate climate considerations into internal goals and processes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think the key point you make about building more capacity in the global south, in developing countries, is critical. And I would like to give some emphasis to boards of financial institutions, particularly development finance institutions. And therefore, the board that I sit on, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, it's a challenge to accelerate the learning around the complexities of climate finance, because it doesn't always fit the traditional templates for those people who are coming out of the traditional financial sectors. So it's really, really important not just to focus on the technical experts, but also boards. So Hector, I was wondering whether you want to just reflect on one of the challenges that you brought up from a learning perspective. What is there you have any? I'm not sure how close you are to the people who are implementing, but what's emerging in your context in terms of how to tackle that gender ownership question?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Well, talking about land tenure, that is very important, because if you have cleared the land tenure, the access to the resources is also clear, and the access to the possible benefits from programs like RED Plus or environmental service or loans or another kind of programs will be clear also. Costa Rica is a country with a relatively clear land tenure, where private property is highly respected, even at the constitutional level. But also we have problems with lands who are not clear who is the owner or who is the possessor. So the lesson learned is that there is no clarity of the land tenure. There is no clarity about the possible benefits. So I think that the government and the different institutions can make arrangement between the government and possessor to give access to the resources and potential benefits. Another thing, now with the resources that we will receive from the RED Plus agreement with the FCPF, is to create a special fund that we can support with financial to women group, to young people groups, without any consideration about what is the land tenure, only by the activity that they are doing in benefit of of a better landscape, resilience to the climate change, and so forth. So I think that this is the lesson learned: how to make arrangements to provide benefits, even though the land tenure is not clear. And the other thing is to create funds to support activities, conservation activities, in our case, doing by women and young people living in the rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so again, it's in a sense the lock-in of particular ownership patterns that you're coming up against, which have got long histories. In the African context, obviously, we're very familiar with that dynamic. So let's move on to Shinaz and see what now that you've had some time to reflect on my question, when you think of equipping people from moving between contexts, what are the challenges around learning?
So thank you for that question, Mark. And actually, it's one that was quite a harsh awakening and learning for us. So the CDK, the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, is going for over 7 years now. What we started off doing was we'd actually send staff in country. So we work in Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, and that model of working fell flat. Because often you don't understand the context, you're not sure the politics, etc. So we then moved to a model where we employ country engagement leads, and they are nationals from that country. So they understand the context, they understand the politics. Often we look for people who have worked in the policy implementation and climate change space. It's not that easy to find. So we take our time to find our country engagement leads, and all our work is then done through them. They work in country with government, because most of our work is with government, understanding what the demand is. We then turn that demand into clear pieces of work which we can respond to. So the way we work now, none of our South-South-North staff actually go directly and work in country. We do everything through the country engagement leads. What we've also learned is there has to be a very strong trust relationship with us and the country engagement leads, but also with these leads and the people they're working with in country. If there's any breach of trust, our work just falls flat. So we can be designing the best workshops, the best peer-to-peer exchanges, but if they're not trusting where we're coming from, it doesn't land well. And a good lesson for us is that initially the program was run by PwC in the UK. We then, as South-South-North, took it over about just over 2 years ago. And in that in itself was quite a learning, because we had to go in and then explain how the whole structure had changed and how we were very cognizant of the need to be Southern-led. So, yeah, so there were lots of lessons for us, Mark. Many of them we learned the hard way, but we've learned and we've adapted, and I think we're running quite an impactful program now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. There's quite a few questions coming up in the chat, which I'll get to in a minute. Some of which are linking to this theme of learning, and others slightly different. So, Surabi, coming to you.
Thank you, Mark. So, I mean, I think from the perspective of, working closely with masons, with electricians who have to look at these new decentralized energy systems or more energy efficient building design, I think of course there's like that first level of skepticism, but what we try and do is sort of look at demonstration projects and exposure sites to be able to get their inputs and thoughts on it. And I think that tends to also, at the smaller scale, you're able to do that and get more insights from them about what are the kinds of local materials that may, in the case of masonry and built environment, what are the kinds of local materials that may have been better utilized in order to have the same kind of impact? Or what are the kinds of local techniques that would have been tried out to get this done? Of course, from a scale perspective and a longer term perspective, I think one aspect is like, how do you institutionalize these sort of green building techniques or solar energy as part of the electrician trade or as part of the masonry trade when people are in vocational schools and in industrial training institutions? And we've often found champion trainers, and so training of trainers or combining that with exposure visits to be able to see how it can really play out. We have done that more with electricians for solar energy solutions, but this is an approach that we are hoping to explore as part of the masonry training as well. And I think there is an aspect of the top down, and how do you make sure that governments are providing mandates and guidelines in terms of kind of design they want for particularly public works like health centers, schools, disaster relief shelters, and then that can trickle down into what are the kinds of courses you need in local industrial training institutions that incorporate local building materials. It could incorporate local building techniques as well, but at least there's a base to say we need more green building design, and we need more decentralized clean energy solutions, and therefore the human resource capacity on the ground needs to be there for that. And I think some level we need the government mandate or guidelines to be able to push that forward.
Right. Okay, so let's open this further to inputs from participants who can raise questions in the chat, and all of you can see the chat. And obviously, let's take the big challenge facing us, which is how do we manage climate action in this post-COVID-19? Well, we're not quite there yet, but hopefully we get there into a post-COVID environment. And it would be good to hear from these different perspectives in different parts of the world how the pandemic may have affected the way that you operate and the challenges that you face. Can I go to Besa and ask you just to reflect on what that means from the climate finance perspective, and maybe link that to the question that's come up around whether you support developing countries, which is obviously a big challenge in this COVID environment, post-COVID environment. Besa?
Yeah, sure. Happy to answer. Happy to kick off the discussion. So in terms of COVID and how we can activate climate action post this crisis, so the preliminary analysis that we're looking here is, I think the future economic stimulus packages that will be adopted by governments and also national climate policies is going to play the key role. So obviously, developed countries are putting forward different packages. EU is putting forward a really big deal, EU Green Deal. I think you all know, 750 billion. But now we need to see what packages developing countries will come up with. But the best practice here says that mainstreaming sustainable and climate resilient development, rather than developing a standalone COVID recovery policy, is inevitable, because there is a saying that we are at this. There's actually an opportunity to leap forward for a more sustainable future. So things like avoiding short-sighted policies of, for example, operationalizing coal mines just so that you can become self-reliant on energy sources is probably going to be not a good idea. But then there are some countries, developing countries, who are actually doing really well by making robust national plans that are long-sighted, and I think Rwanda is a very good example. So they made the very smart policy choices on their national electrification plan and restructuring key energy agencies. So it actually fostered a big public and private investment for clean energy access. So things like that, I think it's really going to be up to stimulus package and national climate policies of the governments themselves. And going back to the question around whether climate policy initiative supports organizations in other countries to build capacity. Yes, we do. So recently we've collaborated with Green Cape and Bertha Center for Social Innovation in South Africa, actually. So we collaborated with these two organizations so that they can implement our method to build a South Africa landscape of climate finance. So CPI is happy to support different organizations in adopting this method. But we're analysis and advisory organization, so we wouldn't provide funding ourselves. So any funding should probably need to be fundraised together. So yeah, long answer short, yes, we help developing countries to build capacity. Thank you.
I think. Yes, just okay.
Hello?
Yeah, please go ahead. I notice you were muted.
Hello?
Please go
Hello,
ahead.
can you hear me?
Yes,
Sorry,
we
there
can
was,
hear you. Please go ahead.
yeah, there was a breakup in my system here. Yeah, so I just wanted to also thank you for that comment. But I think it would be good if the panelists just followed some of the questions and indicated to me if there are any of these questions that you want to respond to or pick up on. But I think there are questions around the linkage between climate policy and SDGs. And although some of that may have been picked up in previous in previous webinars, when it comes to implementation, because this was the focus of this particular webinar, it would be interesting to hear from the panelists what that means. So broadening out the agenda, if you like, from climate to SDGs, and what are the implications of that for implementation. Not sure if anybody on the panel wants to pick that up. Maybe Shanaz, I'm not sure if that's relevant to you.
Yes. No, I'm just thinking actually, Mark, and I mean, often because we work squarely in the climate change space, and often it's seen as something that's cross-cutting in your SDGs. So that each of the SDGs should be having the climate, just like you have climate, and your capacity building. It's seen as cross-cutting. But having said that, I think it's not easy to implement something that's cross-cutting. So I must say, I don't think I'm giving you an answer, but
maybe link that to the adaptation question that's come up. So,
yes, yeah. What was the yeah?
In Basis' presentation, the large bulk of funding is in the mitigation.
Mitigation,
side.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, very thin on adaptation.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering.
Yes. So actually, yeah. So I'm glad. Yeah, I'm actually glad for that question, because it's something we've been also grappling with, Mark. It's how do you make the business case for adaptation? And we're moving more into the space of talking about resilience or the adaptation with the co-benefits. And some of the work that we've also just done now during the COVID crisis was looking at how communities, on the ground communities, are responding to COVID, and then saying they will use those same adaptation strategies during a climate crisis, and how are we going to fund this? Because at the moment, a lot of it is being funded by the community resources, etc. And for us, this is an ongoing piece of work that we're busy with, because the case for adaptation needs to be made. I mean, the Green Climate Fund now has opened a separate window on the enhanced direct access, which will hopefully make it easier for communities to be able to access adaptation funding. But it's not happening quick enough, and adaptation is a big issue for the developing world. So, and sadly, the funding to those adaptation activities, because the business case, like the traditional finance business case, cannot be made for it, is not reaching the communities where it's most needed. So, yeah. So sadly, I can't be a lot more positive about it, but that is it's a big challenge.
That everyone faces. So there's a couple of questions around measurement. So Rabid, you want to pick up this question of climate action and COVID? Please go ahead. But maybe just roll into this question of measurement of project. What kind of tools, methods, indicators. I'm sure you're in that business of impacts beneficiaries. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. So I think in the the post-COVID era, what we became very aware of was sort of decentralization was the name of the game, simply because the lockdown, particularly in India, was quite stringent. So you had communities completely, detached, and whether we started to think about these solutions around agro-processing or cold storage solutions, particularly for farmers who couldn't get their produce into any market. And then on the healthcare side, I think strengthening the primary healthcare system became quite a large priority and an area of interest, including realizing that powering it with clean energy and energy efficiency and built environment just drastically reduces the cost compared to what it would have been otherwise. And of course, a lot of these centers then were looking for, energy for ventilators or having mobile units that could do swab collections. So there were a host of things that came up, and I think we realized that there is a very, very strong need to talk about decentralization, and decentralized clean energy plays very well into that, and of course comes with its own climate related benefits. I think, is there a tool to measure whether climate mitigation contributes to improvement of well-being of project beneficiaries? I don't think it's one tool. I think the mitigation benefits are known. They often take some level of calculation to sort of work out, depending on whether the fuel that you're replacing is kerosene or diesel or simply a backup for the grid, and depends on where the grid is coming from. But I think the important part to look at is, does it contribute to improvement in well-being of project beneficiaries? Yes, because this started off as a project to meet their needs rather than a project to address climate change. And in a way, that's a good thing, that climate change is action on climate change is an automatic benefit that we're getting, rather than it being, the main project and then the development needs are unclear. So I would say, yes, they contribute to improvements in well-being, and typically we track that well-being based on, if you're looking at health, then number of immunizations, IMR, MMR, number of institutional deliveries and safe institutional deliveries. If you're looking at livelihoods, it would be increase in income, increase in productivity, improvement in well-being, just in terms of, people not having to use manual measures to do the same task that now can be solar powered.
Good. Thank you very much. Let me wrap up and then ask our colleagues Bahare and Marco to make some closing comments. I'm really grateful to have been asked to chair a discussion about implementation. So though I'm an academic and we always have to ask the why questions, the how questions are really what matters in the world today, where on the one hand we have the collapsologists who are saying it's all doom and gloom and we're not going to change quickly enough, and we have those who focus on incremental change that may not be accelerating fast enough. And so we need to really attach much greater value to those who are at the coalface, doing this kind of implementation work, learning in ways they might not always fully understand, but that has huge impacts when we do unpack it. So in the way that we have in this conversation. So thank you for organizing this theme, and thanks, Paul, for the invitation. So if I can ask Barry to just make some closing comments, and followed by Marco.
Thank you so much. Before I get started, thank you to Professor Zwilling for the excellent discussion, and also to all our panelists, Baisa, Hector, Shanaz, and Surabi, for the great presentations and very informative discussion that we had today. Colleagues, I'm gonna just share my screen with you in a moment. So my name is Bahar Sayedi. I am a Senior Sustainable Development Officer at UNDESA, and I have the pleasure of closing us off for this learning series. there's been a lot of questions in the chat box that perhaps we didn't get to, but I hope that some of the takeaways that I've included on this slide answer some of those questions or point you to the right direction to getting more details. Just to put what we did in this learning series in context, together with our partners at UNITAR and UNFCCC, we launched this series in December following the Climate Ambition Summit that took place on December 12th. As you know, that marked the 5th year anniversary of the Paris Agreement and really kicked off the next year, which is a critical year for the climate community as countries strive to come to the COP 26 in November with raised ambition on climate and enhanced NDCs. Along with that context, of course, countries continue to plan the implement the SDGs and the Agenda 23 for Sustainable Development, but that work doesn't stop. And in the meantime, all countries are facing the global pandemic. So the question for us and the context was, how does this conversation about creating synergies, implementing synergies between these critical agendas affect what's happening right now in terms of raising global ambition on climate, accelerating the achievement of the SDGs, and at the same time, building back better from the COVID pandemic. So the first webinar really looked at the why question, and we have been talking about the importance of creating synergies for a while now, but that conversation during the first webinar really looked at making the case for it. We know it's important, but what do policymakers need on the ground to build a convincing narrative around making the synergies? So that was the why question. Then during the second webinar, we looked at the how. So now that we have been able to build the narrative and a convincing argument about the synergies, and that needs to happen, how do we actually go about planning it? How do we find opportunities? How do we maximize opportunities? How do we assess trade-offs and navigate those trade-offs? So that was the content for webinar 2. And lastly, today's discussion, of course, was about implementation. We have made the case, we have planned for it, and now we need to make sure it is implemented. So within that conversation of implementation, what are the key barriers and how do we address those barriers? So the slide that you see has some of the main takeaways from the webinars. The first one clearly pointed to the fact that the SDGs, economic recovery, and climate ambition go hand in hand. Each of these complex issues is one piece of the puzzle and not a separate issue on its own. So understanding that they go together is critical. The second point here is, that came out from a colleague who was actually from South Africa as well during the first webinar, was get the facts right and make sure you build a narrative with the constituencies in the country around facts that break the silos and demonstrate the importance of synergies. So if we are transitioning to renewable energy, link that to number of jobs that are created. If we are putting in place energy efficiency measures, how is that going to help businesses save money? If we are going to look at implementing measures for reducing air pollution, how are the citizens' health being protected? So that narrative around facts that really brings gives life to the linkages between the climate and SDGs is critical. We learned about collaboration and leadership, that these are key topics that countries are dealing with. No one organization or entity is going to be able to really take this agenda forward and create the linkages. It is that concept, what we call a whole of society approach, which means it really takes all sectors and all parts of the society to come together, but that governments have a leadership role to play to make sure everyone is on board. During the second webinar, we presented some tools. There's a number of tools out there that really allow practitioners to look at modeling and scenario building. A lot of institutions are involved in this that provide that support. We had a small sample of those institutions in our webinar. What was really key about those tools is that these tools provide the evidence-based assessment that practitioners need on the ground to be able to chart opportunities and trade-offs, and to be able to make informed decisions that hopefully will enable ambitious plans and implementation. We had excellent presentations from countries who have recently gone through the NDC update process. And what they showed us really is that in addition to tools and modeling that is about how to really make an integrated plan, what's also important is governance. At the heart of the government, how do governments bring together the various line ministries? How is the coordination happening so that everyone involved joins forces and really looks at, in this case, it was in the national determined contribution, looks at the climate impacts, but also co-benefits of climate related to jobs, related to health, and so on, and that making those linkages are critical for raising climate ambition overall. And of course, today, again, we talked about implementation challenges. I think finance was a big topic. How do we take advantage of not only sources of finance that are public, but also tapping into other sources, private sector, and how do we mainstream climate and SDG finance into development and national development planning. Of course, capacity building was a big topic, and thanks to all the presentations for really in-depth look at the issue of capacity building, the issue of really, making sure there's a whole of society approach and integration of gender issues, participation from indigenous peoples, and that ownership that is really key for capacity building. Each of the webinars will have a detailed summary that will be posted on the website. So you're more than welcome to get more details there. And there will also be a video of the various webinars for your reference. Now, in terms of just a few words about next steps, of course, this is the last webinar of our series, of this series, but the work doesn't end, and we continue to basically create opportunities for this conversation over the course of the next 12 months. We are very excited that with our partners at UNITAR, we will be launching a course, an e-learning course on harnessing climate and SDG synergies. I will shortly pass it on to my colleague at UNITAR to say a few words about that. We're also looking at opportunities within the year, whether it's global forums or regional platforms, to have more targeted conversations about the climate and SDGs, perhaps thematically organized or looking at specific regions so that we get a bit more in depth on this topic. So examples, the High Level Political Forum, which many of you may be familiar with, is happening in July. That is a global platform where countries come and do kind of a review of a number of SDGs every year. This year, there will be 9 SDGs that will be reviewed. And so we might have conversations around making linkages between climate and those particular SDGs. The COP is a big opportunity. Of course, we typically have a pavilion on the SDGs to allow practitioners and policymakers to come and share their experiences vis-a-vis this synergy dialogue. And as you may know about the UNFCCC dialogues, they take place in the different regions, focusing on regional priorities. So in collaboration with UNFCCC, we are looking at crafting capacity building sessions and seminars around this topic within those regional dialogues. Lastly, we anticipate a global conference on harnessing climate and SDG synergies. The last one was in 2019, hosted by the government of Denmark. We will shortly be able to announce the next one that will take place likely at the end of this year or early next year. Thank you so much. I will end it here. This is the website. Please do visit it. We will update the website as we confirm the upcoming opportunities as we go along. Also, feel free to contact us if you'd like more information or if you'd like to collaborate with us on this topic. Now I'm going to end it here, and I'll pass it on to my colleague, Ambassador Suezo, who's the head of the UNITAR office in New York, to tell us about the e-learning course. Thank you. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Barry. Thank you very much, dear friends of UNDESA. First of all, will be to thank Mark for this amazing coordination today of this webinar. Distinguished panelists, thank you very much. I have to say that I learned a lot today, so many topics and so many things. And since the UNITAR is a training and capacity building for government officials and diplomats around the world with the Sustainable Development Agenda in place since 2015 and the cross-cutting issues or the premises of delivering has won or no one left behind, UNITAR has implemented all set of trainings, capacity building, and methodologies in order not only to amplify the work of specialized agencies, but also the main topics, the substantive topics of the agenda for sustainable development. Climate change and environmental issues are not far away for human rights, for example, or combating poverty, extreme poverty, or well-being of human beings. So we are team up thanks to our call from our dear friend from UNDESA, which we work very closely in different areas, like the high-level political forum, for example. In July, we have a learning center that is run a week before the high-level political forum, and I will invite you to explore that possibility in which we offer to agencies, non-governmental organizations, private sector, the opportunity to come and to say and to share what they are doing during that period of time on implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. So the idea on these webinars has been envisaged, and I wanted to say thank you to Barea and UNDESA to create not only these events that have a time and a form and then may disappear, and nobody will be able to track or to keep a record on institutional memory or what has been said or what has been doing it in order to learn and to advance agendas. So we came with the idea to put together a e-learning course that will be open to all the interested parties, in particular policymakers, which are the diplomats in the United Nations here in New York or in Geneva, in the specialized agencies, and will comprise all the elements that has been developed through the webinars that has been carried on by colleagues or UNDESA. This e-learning process is a kind of modular personal, how I can say, formation in which every participants on these e-learning courses will test each model itself with a quiz or with a quiz is the most appropriate word to use in order to advance to the next module. So that will maintain the possibility for the participants not only to learn, but also to interact with other participants that they will see. The recording of the webinars, the presentations that has been done will be part of those e-learning course. We hope for the first trimester of 2021 we'll be able to deliver, to announce this e-learning course with our colleagues from UNDESA. This is basically what I can say now. We are structuring. We have a specialized methodology on these e-learning courses. We're trying to make them very appealing and interactive and very focused on what we try to achieve. The main topic of this is the synergies about climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals, and may look like there is not the United Nations, and this is one of the big changes of the Sustainable Development Goals. It decided to break the silos about the specialized agencies and the agendas that every one of us is doing. The best things to do is to learn about what the other part is doing in order to really to break the silos and work together. This delivery has one of the major components now in UNITAR learning courses, face-to-face, e-learning, and things like that. So let's hope that we will put together a good product for all of you. We are carefully working on it hand to hand because we are a training institute, but we rely on the substantive part, of the equation. And in this kind of work, the United Nations Sustainable Development are a crucial partner for us in this endeavor. So let's work together. Let's offer a new product, new possibilities to the international community, in particular the policymakers, the diplomats and the governments, non-governmental organizations, civil society. We are intrinsically linked to sustainable development. The United Nations head of state can come and can make a policy about it. But at the end, it's at the grassroots level that these policies are implemented. That's how to make the change. Those are who can really achieve that. And it's imperative that they learn about these processes. So that is our scope, that is our goal. So thank you very much for the opportunity to work together. And hopefully we will put this together in the first trimester of 2021 with this hidden crisis of COVID-19 to has forcing us to work from home. At least the virus, I was saying yesterday in a different Zoom meeting, do something very damaging for us, and is that he asking us to be apart from each other. And we are normally beings that tend to be together. That's why the United Nations was created, to put human beings together in a conference room to talk about each other, to shake hands and to discuss things. And the virus said to us, stay away from each other. Don't get close to each other. This is the most dramatic part of this COVID-19. Information technology, thanks God, is helping us to get together. And so let's make a good use to it responsibly and trying to deliver our program on our activities and work. Resilience is a very key word, and we learned that about climate change. And so let's try to use this to spread, amplify the voice of sustainable development, climate change, and sustainable development goals in a very comprehensive manner. I'll stop here because we have to go back to work on this e-learning course, and we will use all these materials and all the panelists. I thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
So thank you very much to everyone. This is the end. I see it's so interesting. People are not leaving, but we are very grateful to have you all. And thanks to you, Prof. Swilling, for chairing this session. It was very interesting. And thanks to all our participants. Thanks to all our speakers. We are very grateful on behalf of UNDESA, UNFCCC, and UNITA. Thank you. Bye-bye and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.